Thank you for joining us today for what I think will be an interesting discussion about a most interesting man, William F. Buckley Jr. My name is Aaron Steelman, and I'm a senior fellow and policy advisor at the Cato Institute. Bill Buckley burst on the American scene with the publication of God and Man at Yale in 1951. 4 years later, he founded what quickly became the most influential magazine on the right, National Review. Buckley was an individualist from an early age, influenced by such libertarian intellectuals as Albert J. Nock and Frank Chodorow. About the latter, he said, it is quite unlikely that I should have pursued a career as a writer, but for the encouragement he, meaning Chodorow, gave me just out of Yale. Some of Buckley's earliest writings were for Human Events, then edited by Chodorow, as well as the Freeman, under the editorship of Henry Hazlitt, a committed libertarian, and John Chamberlain, a fellow traveler. Buckley soon exerted an important influence in politics and public debate, helping to secure the Republican nomination for president for Barry Goldwater in 1964. Goldwater ran on a largely libertarian platform, inspired by the rugged individualism of the American West in the early years of the 20th century. In fact, he was born in 1908, prior to Arizona even becoming a state. Perhaps particularly relevant for today's discussion is that Buckley provided an institutional intellectual home for Frank Meyer at National Review. Meyer was the most significant proponent of fusionism, an attempt to construct a movement in which libertarians and conservatives could get along. He wished to promote both free markets and civil liberties, while emphasizing that, in his view, traditional social mores and norms are important to maintaining an orderly society. Meyer's libertarian didn't extend to foreign policy, though, as he advocated a rather bellicose foreign policy, particularly toward the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Buckley shared Meyer's enthusiasm for vigorously prosecuting the Cold War, leading to his break with libertarian Murray Rothbard. Though Rothbard, it should be said, maintained his friendship with Meyer until the latter's death in 1972. Still, it is fair to say that throughout Buckley's editorship of National Review, from 1955 to 1990, the magazine generally provided a friendly home for libertarians. Buckley's fame rose sharply during the 1960s. He ran for mayor of New York City on the new Conservative Party ticket. His aim was not to win, but rather to either see the left liberal Republican John Lindsay defeated or to force him to adopt some of Buckley's preferred policies. In the end, Buckley secured more than 13% of the vote. His plan, though, perhaps backfired, as he may have taken more votes from the Democratic candidate, Abe Beame, than he did from Lindsay, with Lindsay ultimately winning. The following year, Buckley began his weekly television program, Firing Line, during which he engaged in discussion with politicians, economists, novelists, as well as ideologues of all stripes. Basically, it seemed to me, anyone that he found interesting. Through the force of his arguments and personality, and let's face it, the fascination engendered by his unique manner and accent, part New England patrician, part Southern drawl, among many other things, he reached perhaps the height of his influence in the 1970s and early 1980s. It was during this period that he wrote a large number of his more than 50 books, including collections of essays, travelogues, and novels, often spy novels. Despite trying, Buckley was never able to complete that quote-unquote big book, his Constitution of Liberty, or his conservative mind. By the time Firing Line ceased production in 1999, Buckley's star was on the wane. During his last decade, with the Cold War having ended, he returned, in some measure, to his early in life, non-interventionist foreign policy views. He expressed skepticism about the Iraq War and American adventurism abroad, more generally, while remaining committed to market-oriented economic policies and holding, albeit inconsistently to be sure, views on civil liberties issues broadly consistent with the liberal tradition. Buckley died at his home in Stamford, Connecticut in 2008. We meet here to discuss his life and his impact a week before what would have been his 100th birthday. Joining us is Sam Tannenhouse, the author of what will surely become the definitive biography of Buckley, namely the 1,000-plus page Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. And I would heartily recommend it, for sure. Buckley was impressed with Sam's 1997 biography of Whittaker Chambers, which I can also recommend, though my views are much less similar with Chambers than they are with Buckley's. Chambers served as a senior editor at National Review in the late 1950s, after leaving the Communist Party, testifying against Alger Hiss, famously, authoring Witness, and turning to the right. Buckley commissioned Sam to write his biography, and the result is the book that we will discuss today. Sam is formerly the editor of the New York Times Book Review and the author of the 2009 book, the highly readable The Death of Conservatism. He is also a distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Also with us today is Walter Olson, a senior fellow at Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. Wally is the author of several books, including The Litigation Explosion, What Happened When America Unleashed the Lawsuit, as well as The Rule of Lawyers, How the New Litigation Elite Threatens America's Rule of Law. He also formerly ran and was the principal writer for the popular blog Overlawyered. Prior to joining Cato in 2010, Wally worked at the Manhattan Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, where he worked on Regulation Magazine, which is now published by Cato. Wally was a contributing editor at National Review for more than 3 years, writing unsigned economic editorials, and he was also an acquaintance of Buckley's. Sam's going to start with some remarks about the book and Buckley, and then Wally and Sam will engage in conversation, with hopefully me chiming in once in a while with something worthy to say. We'll then take questions from our online audience. Thank you again very, very much for joining us. You can submit your questions via the event's webpage, Facebook, YouTube, and X at #CatoEvents. With that, Sam, please get us started.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Great to see you, Wally. What we didn't mention is that Wally used to write book reviews for us, very elegant book reviews, when I was the editor of the New York Times Book Review. I discovered that Wally was very good writing about fiction, which is actually a good skill for anyone who wants to observe American life. And so my colleague Elida Becker used to give Wally lots of reviews, lots of books to review. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really glad, Aaron, you brought up the libertarian component and the life, the journey, the ideology of William F. Buckley Jr. Well, let's call him Bill. Anyone who ever met him called him Bill, including the people who worked in the mailroom at National Review. He absolutely insisted you call him that. So I don't want listeners to think I'm inventing a kind of false intimacy by calling him Bill Buckley. He was a singular figure, as we know, born in 1925, died in 1983 at the age of 82 years old, and was a phenom. He's that rarest of things, which was an intellectual prodigy. We're used to prodigies of various kinds: chess, math, tennis, musical, but not intellectual prodigies, which meant he had a mature mind at a very early age, which emerged in the first political campaign he got involved in, the non-intervention movement, America First, 1940-41, when he was a teenager, and showed remarkable forensic skill in debates. I found the texts of them at his prep school, Millbrook, in Dutchess County, New York. He was from Connecticut, what's called the northwest corner of Connecticut. Beautiful area. It's very close to the Berkshire Mountains. Then he went to Yale, and at Yale it became a sensation. And that led to the famous, and in some ways probably still, be interested in to hear Wally on this. His most important book, God and Man at Yale. That's the book published when he was 25, based on his experiences in the classroom and his own writings at Yale, where he'd been the editor, the chairman, as they called it then, which meant the chief editorial writer for the Yale Daily News. He was a brilliant, charismatic person on campus. And this is very important because while others on the right had been attacking elite universities really since the 1930s, Buckley did it from the very top of the ivory tower. You know, he was tapped for Skull and Bones. He was very much a big man on campus. And then he kind of cried foul, but in a very engaging, brilliantly ironic prose style, which he further refined through his life. And he pointed out that even at conservative Yale, founded by Protestant clergy for the education of Protestant clergy, Yale had become atheist on the one hand, not surprising in his era, late 1940s. The bigger surprise was that the economics being taught was really Keynesian New Deal economics. And Buckley had been raised in very much a kind of late 19th century, early 20th century, we'll call it Gilded Age laissez-faire free marketeerism. His own father had made his first fortune in Mexico, Mexican oil. Father was from South Texas. And Aaron referred to Buckley's unusual accent, which he correctly identified as being partly Anglo, partly Southern, also inflected by European languages. Buckley spoke both Spanish and French before he learned English. And so he grew up one of 10 children, Buckley did. He had 9 siblings who were almost all of them, impassioned libertarians. This was the era when the great Americans were the tycoons and empire builders. And that's what Buckley's own father aspired to be. Then came the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s. That destroyed his first fortune. Later came the stock market crash, which ruined his second fortune made in Venezuelan oil. And then came the New Deal. And the New Deal seemed to pull the rug out from everything and everyone. And now we're going to get to a point I want to bring Wally in on too, because one of the fun aspects of this book that I finally get to talk about after all the interviews I've done, reviews I've seen, is we get to talk about Buckley's first ideological hero. Now, the book is very much a chronology. As Aaron pointed out, it's a story. I'm a storyteller. I'm not a theorist. I hope I'm not dumb, but I'm not a big thinker. I'm a storyteller. And the first political idol Buckley had was Charles Lindbergh, the leader of the America First Committee movement. But his first intellectual hero was the quite amazing Albert J. Nock, who was really, I think we would say, you guys know better, he's the pioneer of what we think of as the modern individualist or libertarian movement. Buckley's father met Nock as early as 1937, I found. So Bill Buckley at that point was about to turn 12 years old. Nock also lived in Litchfield County, Connecticut. He lived in a town that, Wally, I think you know pretty well, around Canaan, Connecticut. And Buckley Sr. would send his car over or drive himself, bring Albert Nock for dinner in the Buckley's 47-acre estate, the mansion they had. And Bill Buckley said that two of them, his father and Albert Nock, would recite the sins of the New Deal well past midnight, day after day. And the young Buckley couldn't even really follow the conversation. He told me I was much more interested in boats and horseback riding than I was in what this unusual intellectual had to say. But as Buckley got a little older, by his mid to late teens, he began reading Nock. And that was where he discovered the joys of exquisite prose writing, which will surprise some people because Nock had a famously pure, simple style. And Buckley had a beautiful style, but was very flamboyant and Latinate. And that was Buckley's individuality. He was fusing talk about fusion. He was fusing his ideological, his kind of linguistic influences. But what Nock really created for him and for many others. H.L. Mencken thought Knock was the greatest essayist of that period, beginning in the 1920s through the 1930s, was an older idea of what America ought to be, was one much more closely aligned with what Wilmore Kendall or Charles Kessler would call the virtuous people of the early founding. And Knock had a feel for that. It seemed to flow through his veins. A reviewer of one of his books said, Knock writes as if 1789 never happened. It's interesting he says 1789, the French Revolution, right, and not events in the United States. But that's the kind of American purity he had. At the same time, like Buckley's, all the Buckleys, Knock traveled all over the world. He lived in Germany, he lived in France, he lived in Belgium, but he was an American original. So I want Wally to help just chime in on this. Tell us a little bit about your take on Knock's influence.
Knock gets only a passing mention in your book, and of course I picked right up on it, and many Cato readers also will. The parts of Knock's influence, I think, became the common talk of the conservative movement. Knock is identified with the idea of the remnant, which is that there is this small minority that has kept the torch of civilized ideas, as a dark age has descended, and that it's up to them to pay it forward until some future point at which people will be willing to rediscover old truths. Now, this was something that I heard all the time in NR adjacent conservative circles over many, many years. So the remnant part of it, I would just point out, and I don't want us to have to get into too deep into the weeds, but the remnant idea is kind of the opposite of populism in some ways. And Knock, if I'm reading him correctly, was a supremely anti-populist writer, very much against the mass mind. And Buckley had a lot of those ideas early in his career. Remember that the title of his great book was going to be The Revolt Against the Masses. Again, a supremely unpopulist or anti-populist kind of title. But Buckley changed, and I think part of what you described so well over the pages of the book is that Buckley moved away from some of the more dramatic and extreme views of his youth. Recognizing himself as the leader of a movement, he began triangulating, if as it were, that's a negative word, but he began balancing a bunch of different factions that were factions within his mind as well as factions at his magazine. And some of those turned out to be populist, especially, I think, after he ran for mayor of New York and found that it wasn't the first time, but he was connecting with very plain, ordinary people in a way that the elites weren't. And it began, I think, shifting the balance in his mind. He became so famous for that line, I'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston phone book than by the faculty of Harvard University. Now, it was always a funny line, and it probably also drew from his anti-university views. But he may have been anti-university, but he was not anti-elitism at all. And that's aside from the lifestyle and the inherited money. Knockism was elitism. And so I think that part of Knockism, in some ways, has been abandoned by the conservative movement, and was abandoned to a large extent by Buckley, who stopped being willing to say certain types of things.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned his Bill Buckley's uncompleted magnum opus was supposed to be a book called, as you said, The Revolt Against the Masses, taken directly from Ortega Gasset's book, The Revolt of the Masses, which was a favorite text of Albert Knox. And Buckley, this is what sets him apart, read it in the original Spanish. And it was taught to him as well by Wilmore Kendall, his professor at Yale, and that's where Buckley was introduced to the book. And you raised this very interesting balance that Buckley was always making. I think you're right to be reluctant to use the word triangulate. Buckley was highly strategic, but and tactical, but he was never cynical. What he looked for was the kind of integrated conservative. There's a big word he would use when one of the liberal Catholics he admired most, the editor of Commonweal, John Cogley, praised him on television when Buckley was young, and Buckley was quite taken by this. He didn't think Cogley, who was very much on the left, would be so kind to him. And Buckley wrote him a letter, and he said, I hope that I can show the same integrity that you did. And I took him, Buckley with all this Latin, to mean integrity in the original sense of being a whole person, an integer, all these things brought together. What Knock presented for Buckley, and now I will protest mildly, Wally, and say it's a little more than a passing mention, I think, in the book. It's just that the book is so long, and Knock comes in early, and then we've moved on. But it is true. I was at one point in the earlier draft of the book, my editor said, we seem to be writing a biography of Albert Nock rather than William Buckley at this point. So I took some of that out. But what was important was the originality and brilliance of Knock's mind. Because he was not political in some ways. He seldom voted. He thought all politicians were charlatans. And this was something he developed from or had shared with his friend H.L. Mencken. I want to make an aside here. This amazed me, and I kicked myself for not doing more with it. Bill Buckley was not a good interview because he was too public a figure, and he had so many answers to so many questions. It's like interviewing a presidential candidate. But sometimes he would just make a casual statement, and it was up to me to follow up on it. And here's one where I failed, I will confess. I asked him about H.L. Mencken once, and he said, oh, yes, Albert Nock took me to meet Mencken when Buckley was a teenager. And I didn't even – and he said, well, I found Mencken sort of haughty, unlike Nock, who was very warm and genteel. And I thought, why did I not have 10 follow-up questions on meeting H.L. Mencken?
Well, when Bill Buckley finds you haughty, that's I myself wondered so much about the role of H.L. Mencken because, of course, he was checking off the national stage because of his stroke right around the time that Buckley was coming onto it, and so I wondered Mencken had in many ways been the figure that Buckley was replacing, as it were. I don't know whether that's
it's an interesting question. Yeah,
but Knock among his other. We're getting some interference.
I want to interject just one thing. So Knock and Mencken, to be sure, they did not particularly want to engage in politics. It strikes me as though Buckley was rather reluctant to engage in politics too. He temperamentally, it seems to me, was quite a libertarian. I mean, he would have been quite fine, I think, having politics leave him alone. But as he said. Or to leave politics alone. But as he said, politics is not going to leave me alone. So therefore, I must engage. But when he was off the camera or wasn't writing, he seemed quite disinterested in politics. He'd rather talk about pretty much anything else, like many people have said.
He told me, he said, I only talk about politics when I'm paid to do it. And he was paid a lot to do it. And he needed the money. Yeah, otherwise he talked about the New Yorker magazine, his favorite magazine. He talked about the New York Times, his favorite newspaper. He talked about sailing. He talked about music. In many ways, you would not think you were talking to an ideological person at all.
And I'd like to bring in a couple more anecdotes from the book. One of them, just we can't talk about Albert J. Nock all day, but he, of course, was editor of the Freeman for a long time, and Nock was. And when Buckley began making his move after God and Man and Ale had succeeded, he looked around, and at this point, and I do think that Buckley's going to go down as one of the great magazine founders of his era, and he had two or three talents. One of them is that he could spot good writing. Another is that he was endlessly on the move and ambitious. And the third is that he had a killer instinct. Well, let me turn to the killer instinct because you write in the book that at the time Buckley started, the Freeman was the most respected and recognized journal on the right, and it tended libertarian. But it was having problems. It was politically divided. It was divided on Joe McCarthy. So what did Buckley do? He goes in and he steals their talent. He hires John Chamberlain, he hires Suzanne LaFollette, he hires Frank Meyer, and of course deals a severe blow to a magazine that was stumbling, and soon is on top himself. And the Freeman survived, but changed a lot. So So part of that is that killer instinct, which I have to admire, in the way he was founding an institution by stepping his way up. The other thing, though, and it gets us back to this matter of how Buckley managed the presence of libertarians. That's how I've come to think of it. It's not approving or disapproving, but when he did this, he wrote two articles, one for Commonweal, which you've mentioned, and one for the Freeman itself, on how, in his view, things had to change. And the pivot here was anti-communism. And that's why I think that your training writing the great biography of Whittaker Chambers, it doesn't surprise me that Buckley picked you as the authorized biographer, because Chambers' career and anti-communism, to me, were the entire pivot of what drove Buckley ideology. It wasn't American elections mostly, and who happened to be running. But let me read just a bit or two from those. In Commonweal, he wrote that even followers of L.J. Nock, like himself, quote, have got to accept big government for the duration, unquote. That meaning until communism was defeated, and even accept, quote, a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores. Yikes. And in the Freeman, he wrote, quote, to beat the Soviet Union, he argued, this is all from your book, of course, we must to an extent imitate the Soviet Union. And then he talks about conscription and the heavy taxation that is going to be needed and the large new bureaucracy. Well, I'm glad I didn't read that until I saw your book, because I would have been so upset. And in Buckley's defense, of course, that's not how he ran the magazine, and that's not how he ran the rest of his career. He backed off some of that willingness to countenance big government. But even so, it's interesting how he saw from the very beginning that he didn't want the old mix that he found in conservatism. He wanted a new mix.
Well, what's interesting also about that, Wally, this is part of Buckley's brilliance. I would add his other genius was for language. He was not a great writer. He was a very good writer. He was a brilliant speaker. He was amazingly articulate, could summon words so easily. But what's striking to me about those sentences that I quote in my book is in describing the sacrifices that need to be made, he uses exactly the vocabulary that a libertarian would have used. In other words, he doesn't say, well, we're not going to be totalitarian if we create a big government. He says, no, we're going to have to imitate the totalitarians. So there's a signal that he knows what he's saying. You know who was really upset by that was Murray Rothbard. Rothbard and Buckley are an interesting story. Here's something I didn't put in the book that I probably should have. Those of you who are familiar with Buckley's third book, and listen, he wrote so many, even he couldn't keep the sequences straight. Up from Liberalism, may remember there's a fairly detailed discussion of Social Security and how it's not economically or fiscally feasible. Murray Rothbard wrote that for him.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Buckley did. Yeah. Go ahead, Aaron. You were going to say something, I think.
Yes, and so certainly Buckley and Rothbard were friends until their split in 1959 or 60 when Khrushchev came to the United States, and Buckley claimed that that Rothbard was basically clapping as Khrushchev was going down the streets of New York City, and that led to their split. But Rothbard was a regular contributor on economic issues to National Review from 55 to 59. And he, of course, were great friends with Frank Meyer, who he had known for a while, and then got to know through the Volcker Fund. So he wrote many book reviews for National Review during that time. I believe that Rothbard wanted to have that sort of arrangement, but his views on foreign policy always seem to take precedent over his other views. And you see this in the 60s when he's trying to make arrangements to sort of get in with the new left, because he viewed foreign policy as the paramount issue. And by that time, it seems to me that the arrangement between Buckley and Rothbard was so severed that it was never to be repaired. And in fact, they have a series of op-eds in the New York Times in 1971 that are quite vicious. So it's quite a shame. I mean, but Rothbard's personality was such that he often had splits with other people, and perhaps it was inevitable that he was going to have one with Buckley as well.
Well, a couple of things that are interesting about that, Aaron, is first of all, so our audience should stop and consider that Murray Rothbard and William Buckley were having their ideological battle, conducting it on the op-ed page of the New York Times.
Yeah.
It was a different world back then, number one.
Yeah.
And just for an analogy, and this is not to be provocative, but just something to think about. It's true, Rothbard was a leader of that left-right alliance. My good friend Ron Radosh was part of that too. There were Leonard Liggio, a series of very interesting thinkers on the left and right who kind of found each other over the Vietnam War. A similar thing, I don't want to make too much of it, but a similar thing is happening with Gaza right now, where you see left and right beginning to question the orthodoxy on the Middle East and sometimes sound a little bit like one another. And it almost feels like a generational split. I'm always impressed with Rothbard, whom I regret I never met, that he had a feel for generational politics. Buckley did too, and they were very much rivals in that sense. There is I do not want to say a profanity, but somebody has a quote of something very funny Rothbard said to Frank Meyer. So I'll just use a shorthand term for the profanity. And that is when Meyer was at the very peak of those brilliant debates he's having with Brent Bozell about liberty versus virtue and the West. And remember, Bozell was very big on the Christian West. And Noel Parmentel, a very interesting figure in that culture back then. He was kind of someone called him the Norman Mailer of the right. He was this kind of provocateur who made the scene in New York, was very close to all these people. And Parmentel, who died, was the mentor and boyfriend of Joan Didion for many years, and who was another protege of both Frank Meyer and Bill Buckley. And Noel told me a few years ago, before he died, that Frank Meyer, that when Frank was holding forth on the West, Murray Rothbard said to him, "What does an effing Jew from Newark know about the Christian West?" Which is just hilarious. That's how they talked back then. They were much more direct in it, and they're more kind of at ease with of the ethnicity, things that make people very nervous now. And there was a constant one-upmanship. I'll tell you another story about Rothbard is before I started writing about Buckley, when I was writing about Whittaker Chambers, and I'd hear from Buckley a lot. That's why he was such a wonderful mentor. Is I was nobody from nowhere, very young, writing this book, and you could not be more famous than Bill Buckley was at this point. And he called me up just to see how I was doing. And he read me aloud something that Rothbard had written about him that was quite scathing. And I didn't know any of this politics at that time. I could tell you a good bit about Trotskyites at CCNY in Columbia in the 1930s, but I didn't know this later history. And he read me these scathing sentences by that Rothbard had written. And I said to this famous older man, Bill Buckley, "Well, how do you react to something like that? Do you laugh it off?" And he said, "No, I don't laugh it off." He said, I'm not a good thinker. He said, "I would never say something like that." He said, "For instance, I would never say Gore Vidal is a bad writer." And I thought that's interesting because anybody who's aware of the Buckley Vidal enmity knows that there was, as Bill Rush said, the snake in the mongoose, and yet there were lines that were drawn that Buckley thought you should always respect. So Murray Rothbard wasn't showing him proper deference. And it was interesting to me that it mattered so much. It was only later that I realized how big a figure Rothbard was. And so it did hurt.
Did Rothbard say that Buckley was not a competent thinker or not a competent writer? Because I can see Buckley bristling about the writing side. He knew good copy, and others, that if he wanted to be remembered for three or four things, writing good copy would be one of them. But his claims were surprisingly modest as far as being a systematic thinker.
Well,
And
that's
he
a good
always
point.
knew people would disagreed with him. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it was more that I'm trying to remember what Rothbard had written. I think he wasn't taking Buckley seriously as an intellectual, maybe, and that's what he was quite sensitive about. As you mentioned, he was unable to write that book. It's interesting. They called The Revolt Against the Masses, which was supposed to be a kind of Knockian book, and it's interesting about that because he gave a talk the other day. And a fairly well-known conservative was in the audience, and he kind of challenged me on that. And he said, "Well, did you actually see the pages Buckley wrote?" I said, "Of course I saw them. They're in his files. That's what I described in the book." And I said the surprise for me was not that Buckley couldn't complete the argument; he didn't even really know where to begin. He didn't in making the case for conservatism. If you look at even the titles of his books, and he was a brilliant titler of books. There was Frank Chodoroff who gave him most of the title for God and Man at Yale. He and Buckley worked it out together. Up from liberalism, well, it's liberalism in the title. McCarthy and His Enemies is more about the enemies than about the case he wants to make for McCarthy. So there's very much a kind of debater's counter puncher in Buckley, and that also shows that he wasn't the original thinker some others were.
So I would like to say, in the grand scheme of things, Rothbard was rather unimportant to National Review after 1960. But I think it is useful to say that Rothbard, Buckley, and Meyer had such commanding personalities that in 1972, when Meyer died, Rothbard wrote this very generous obituary in the Libertarian Forum for Meyer. And on the day of Meyer's death, Buckley called up Gene, his son, and was in tears and just said, "Your father was a great man," and had to hang up the phone. So the mutual admiration that they had, I think, was both ideological and it also was personality driven. They were men of ideas. And while Buckley, I think Wally quite correctly said that Buckley never really took himself seriously as a thinker in the way I think he perhaps underrated himself as a thinker. They all were very serious people, and so that sort of that three-way relationship is an interesting one.
Well, you know what else they were is all three of them were enormously cultured. Yes. And you might not think necessarily of Rothbard that way because he cultivated more the style of someone like Chodoroff, whereas Buckley was very elegant and genteel, and Meyer was kind of professorial. But when I was writing about Whittaker Chambers all those years ago, I found a letter when Chambers had started writing for National Review. And it's interesting what you mentioned about the break over Khrushchev because that's what severed Chambers' relationship with National Review. Was disagreements about Khrushchev. He thought National Review was reacting to Khrushchev as if he were Stalin when he wasn't. But at any rate, in the correspondence from Meyer, he wrote to Chambers and said, "Well, I can get you a special subscription to the Boston Athenaeum, so they'll send books to you." Because Chambers read in many languages, and Meyer knew this is what he wanted to do. And he took Chambers on those terms as an intellectual in that way. And of course, we know from the new biography of Frank Meyer and from some of the research that I found just in FBI files and such, that in England, he was a really formidable figure as a young organizer. We know his sons were named for, famous communists who fought and died in the Spanish Civil War, but highly, highly cultured. And an example of that is the best known writing about another figure in this firmament, Wilmore Kendall, highly unusual, brilliant man, is the famous short story by Saul Bellow called Mosby's Memoirs, which is the title story of Bellow's first short story collection. And it was Gary Wills who first wrote that the portrait of Mosby, as he's called, the name taken from the Confederate colonel, the guerrilla fighter, that the figure was really Kendall. He's described Kendall in great precision. And then a young scholar, Joshua Tate, found the letter where Bellow described this to Kendall's widow. But when I asked Wills, well, how did you know it was about Wilmore Kendall? He said, oh, Frank Meyer told me. Because he was that connected with the literary world. And I think this is something we forget. I thought about this in connection with a lot of the cultural conservatism surrounding us now. What one of the first conversations the very young Wills, had with Chambers, Jim Burnham, Buckley, and Meyer was about the great new novel Nabokov's Lolita in 1959. Which we're hearing in a different context now with Jeffrey Epstein. But it was a literary work. That's how they received it. They received it as a work of a great emigre writer and a literary man. And that's what the culture of National Review was like. So when the younger people came through, Didion and Wills, John Leonard, who was my predecessor by many years of the New York Times Book Review, John Gregory Dunn, many of them wrote for National Review. It was that literary aspect of National Review, the back of the book, which was important to them, essential to Buckley. It was a New York magazine. As you've said, the 1960s and 70s were his great decade. To be taken seriously in the intellectual culture Buckley wanted to conquer, as you both quite rightly say, as much as politics, it was a cultural war. You had to be respected. You wanted people reading your book reviews and film reviews and such. And that's where Buckley's eye for talent was so important.
As the moderator, I would like to get Wally to speak perhaps. So we've mainly been speaking about, we've gotten up until the early 70s, but I would like Wally to perhaps comment on the period after that and Buckley's relationship with libertarianism during that period. Wally?
Well, sure. I wrote for the magazine in the second Reagan term, which is just when Sam's book kind of leaves off and begins quickly summarizing. And during that period, and thank you, Sam, for saying that the magazine was well written and edited during those days. I feel vicariously complimented. But there was that what I described earlier as Buckley's management of the libertarian and the other elements in his grouping. I'm not going to call it coalition. And part of that was that he loved having libertarians write about the economic and adjacent stuff. So I actually fit in quite well that way. There were a number of reasons why I fit in well. They loved humor, and I can write economics funny, and that's what I did for 3 years. And they loved that it was funny. I can back up generally what Sam says about the atmosphere of the magazine, the shambling townhouse with the stacks of things in wrong places, how wonderful it was to work with Priscilla Buckley. I couldn't tell, although the book makes it evident, that probably the magazine had peaked a few years before that. And with the demise of communism, there was to be kicked out from under it. The main reason for keeping the various factions together, the main reason for Buckley to have founded it with the demise of the Soviet Union. That having been said, it was, in many ways, it was a lovely place to work because there were a lot of big writing talents connected with it. Rick Brookhiser was the one who recruited me, and he's an interesting talent to this very day. But I'd like to throw in, just because I'm not sure, haven't been able to do so far, an anecdote from Jeff Hart, who gets a mention in the book, who has passed away a few years ago. But he was one of the NR regulars who was by no means a libertarian. It would never be mistaken for a libertarian. But one day, I was always surprised that Jeff Hart treated me very, very cordially. And finally, I got a chance to talk to him and said, am I not perhaps a little too libertarian for you? And he said, no. He said, he confirmed, I'm the farthest thing from a libertarian myself, but he said, if the movement ever loses its libertarians, it will be ruined, because the libertarians keep all of the other conservative factions honest, he said. All of the others get to daydreaming about how they would use power, and if the libertarians aren't there to remind them that power corrupts and power has unintended consequences, and power fails to make life better when it begins bossing people around, they will go off in their directions, and the national security people will yield to one temptation, and the social issues people will yield to another. And so he said, I'd advise people, don't put the libertarians on top, but always make sure they're in the tent. And I think that was Buckley's own view, which I was hearing at one remove.
Yeah, that's a great observation, beautifully phrased, I must say, too. You remind me of something else, which is when, in my telling of the story, and every biographer who goes about their work seriously really creates a kind of moral drama around the figure, and that's what I do. And to me, the great crisis came in the Nixon years when Buckley was working for him. Paradoxically, we'll get to Reagan. Buckley helped create Reagan and Reaganism, and you mentioned earlier, Aaron, that Buckley badly lost the campaign for mayor in 1965, but kept alive the conservative arguments. Well, shortly thereafter, he flew out to California to confer with Reagan, who was getting ready to run for governor of California. And Buckley was now a big enough presence that his early endorsement mattered. And so that was Buckley, the far-ranging and wide-searching political actor and strategist who saw very early on Reagan was talented. However, when others at National Review, including Bill Rusher, the publisher, preferred Reagan in 1968, and this is a big story in the book, Buckley rejected him in favor of Nixon. And there were some on the right, and Bill Rusher was certainly one of them, who thought that was a fatal error Buckley had made, and Buckley owned up to it later on. But I mention this, I bring up Nixon, because Buckley found himself involved in an unexpected way as someone who knew too much about Watergate, because his CIA director, when Buckley had been in the CIA in Mexico in 1950-51, was E. Howard Hunt, who was a ringleader of the Watergate break-in and who confessed everything to Buckley, who carried this enormous burden of knowledge. Well, when they finally decided, National Review, Buckley pulled aside his older brother, James Buckley, the senator, who made a statement saying Nixon should resign. The argument they made is the one you just brought up, Wally. It was James Burnham who said Nixon's become a Caesarist president. That was his term for what was becoming more popularly, widely known as the imperial president. National Review was the first really major publication in America, one with a broad readership that always challenged presidential supremacy. James Burnham wrote an important book, Congress and the American Tradition, that called for the restoration of Congress, which, as the Constitution says, is the first of the three branches. And now we're seeing that argument being made from the left. My friend Sam Moyne at Yale made that argument at the Times the other day. And so in that sense, it's really important to keep that aspect of the skepticism of big government that was always part of Buckley, always part of Albert Knox thinking as well. And that's why it was striking to me, Wally, when you read those early sentences of Buckley's endorsing what Murray Rothbard and others would call the warfare state. His language gives him away because he's using the same vocabulary as the individualists did. Yes, we will have to become totalitarian. Yes, we will have to become a militarized nation. He's almost parodying himself when he says that. And one thing to add, in 1993, after the Soviet Union was finished, Bill Buckley brings out his next collection of essays. It's Happy Days, right? We're here again, Reflections of a Libertarian. He now calls himself once more now that the Cold War is over.
So as the moderator, I should say that we were to wrap up at 1 o'clock. However, I had originally scheduled this to go a bit beyond that. And this may not make the conference team very happy, but I think it won't make them particularly unhappy. The two of you gentlemen have time to perhaps extend it a bit past 1 o'clock so we can also take questions?
Yeah, we have to get the questions in, right?
Yeah,
Sure.
for sure.
Yeah,
But
let's do it.
I think we need to get to toward the end of Buckley's life. After firing line the last decade. I do want to add something about Nixon, which strikes me as relevant for today's political climate. There is a famous scene in Chris Buckley's book, Losing Mom and Pop. And he and his father, Chris and his father, are in the sauna in 1973. And Chris says, "What's going to happen?" And Bill responds, "It's not going to be good, but this is the right thing to do. The constitutional order requires it. We cannot have this sort of executive power wielded in the manner that it is." And to me, that gets to sort of Buckley's view about what is fundamentally good constitutional structure.
Yeah, and something I would add to that too. One of the fascinating and enchanting things about Buckley is he had this. He was a wonderful phrase maker, but he had a slightly awkward one that he called the conservative demonstration. He said it's hard to, and Brett Bozell picked up, and he echoes that term in the famous book he wrote for Goldwater, The Conscience of a Conservative. And Buckley's life really ended up being the conservative demonstration he couldn't write. He could show you how to live like a conservative. And one thing I liked about that was he never made excessive claims for himself. So there's a wonderful moment after Reagan has been elected. He's into the second term. Buckley's turned 60. And a very young, very gifted young newspaper reporter named David Remnick, who at that point is a styles reporter for the Washington Post. He's a long way from being the great chronicler of the Soviet Union's collapse and Lenin's tomb, not to mention the editor of the New Yorker magazine, goes to see Buckley, whom he really admires, on his 60th birthday. And he needles him a little bit. And he says, well, people are reading Human Events a little more than they're reading National Review. And isn't George Will being read more as George Will, who was another of Buckley's proteges, being read more than you? What do you think of that? Buckley said, I'm all for it. He said, I never said it was about one man or that it should be about one man. The more the merrier. And it's that sense of kind of, there was an egalitarianism about Buckley. Well, we didn't touch on that somehow because it's surprising to people. He had that manner that was very aristocratic, but when he dealt with you, with one as a person, he was entirely egalitarian.
You felt you had his whole attention, and it was remarkable. As you say, he did not have any dog in the manger attitude at all toward others' success. And at some level, George Will's column succeeded his because George Will was willing to put in the research, and make the column, better reading. But I don't think he would begrudge something like that ever. If we have a minute, and I know we've got to get to questions, but you emphasize something that I want to give a twist to, which is Buckley's gifts for friendship. It's what everyone takes away who knew him. It was how generous, and to me, my experience was just the same, which was he was very generous, unexpectedly, and warmly. But several of the different passages in your book show him taking friendship too far. He was friends with, like Roy Cohn, one of the worst figures in American life, and so he wrote, character letters for Cohn when he began getting in trouble. He was friends with this jailhouse lawyer who had committed a murder, and he let the friendship completely lead him out of the instincts to check the guy's story. And you could multiply that in McCarthy himself, Nixon. These stories that you present as some of the low points of his career often were friendship that was taken to a point of unreasonable faith in the person he was friends with. How do you react?
That's absolutely right. One of my readers for this book, he was kind of a horse whisperer, as they say, was Gary Wills, who was the one survivor. So, he's still alive. He turned 90, and he'll be 91. from the early period in National Review, and I sent him the galley, and he read it. He's in a nursing home now. He read 100 pages a day. He said it's all he can manage, and he sent me detailed notes. And at one point, he said, "Here's a list." There's a phrase the great journalist Dwight McDonald came up with for Buckley that I introduced early in the book, and it becomes an echo throughout. He said, "Well, young Mr. Buckley has a taste for traveling in low company," he said. So Gary Wills wrote out a list of all those low company travelers of his, and it's pretty long. Wally just mentioned a lot of them, and sometimes with dire consequences. Not only does he agitate for the release of the death row inmate, that man came within an inch of murdering another person. And Buckley is oddly unrepentant about all of this. And that gets to a side of Buckley we haven't touched. This isn't the place to do it, but his Catholicism. And the Catholicism created, as best as I could understand it, a feeling Buckley had of his own kind of radiant innocence, right? See, there were other writers of that time in the 1960s when Buckley took up the case of Edgar Smith, this death row inmate, who championed murderers. It became a kind of vogue for literary men in that period. Truman Capote and William Styrwin and Norman Mailer. Buckley was the only one who persuaded himself his guy was innocent. And that was because he had to think he was championing an innocent man. He's not the same
I
about
would like to add one more point about Buckley's, I think, remarkable capacity for friendship. I certainly agree with what Wally and Sam have said, but Sam previously mentioned that Buckley was not the wealthy man that many people believed him to be. Now, to be sure, some of this was through perpetual travel, spending winters in Gstaad with John Kenneth Galbraith. I mean, these were extravagant things. But his capacity for helping people out without recognition was quite remarkable. And his ability and desire to, having only one son, to gift to his nephews and nieces speaks a lot to his spirit, I believe. And so, yes, he had bad judgment. And we cannot overlook that. But I think we must also take into consideration his magnanimous spirit.
And what I would add, this will bring us back to our previous discussion, and then we can get right to questions, is that's also reflective of this idea, very much part of the individualist culture he came out of, later called libertarianism, of voluntarism, of philanthropy. You're going to help people out, but through your own generosity. His father was the same way. Buckley got a lot of that from his father, loaning money to people constantly, helping them out, and coming to their defense, asking for no credit, even recognition of it. So yes, it's a wonderful aspect of his character. I was a beneficiary of it, and so was Wally. So we have some questions here, Aaron. You're going to throw some at us.
We have many, many that deal with issues that we've already discussed. But I would like to ask this. It comes from a fellow named Bob Franklin. It says the young Bill Buckley was drawn to the early American First movement. I'm curious to know what you believe he would have reacted, how he would have reacted to the current America First movement.
Very interesting question, because what it would come down to is how would Bill Buckley assess the geopolitics of this moment? For instance, as you mentioned, Aaron, I think it was you who mentioned it, he was quite skeptical about the second Iraq war, and he kind of came along and did due diligence and said tried to support the administration as much as he could, but he was very skeptical of it right from the beginning. That's one reason he was not as tough in the previous Gulf incursion on Pat Buchanan as people now say he was. It is actually mistaken. He was quite sympathetic toward that view, as were Gene Kirkpatrick and Irving Kristol, father of Bill. They were also skeptical about global engagements once communism was defeated. So the next question would be, and I'd be curious to know what Wally thinks of this, if he assessed the global politics of our moment, would he see the same threat that he saw in global communism? I just don't know. I don't know if it feels as organized and as single-minded and as sort of ideologically disciplined as the totalitarianism he opposed. What do you think, Wally?
Yeah. Well, in the 1950s, he chose to place himself at the head of the intellectual movement to fight the Soviet Union. And I don't think he would see current circumstances as presenting any parallel, even with China's having ambitions. So in that sense, I think he would, as I would agree, the foreign policy of his later years was kind of mixed and in between. He was famously for giving the Panama Canal back to Panama. And again, the movement that had once marched behind him had split up and was now moving in different directions. There was no movement to lead. I don't think he would have therefore been too notable on either side.
Wally, why do you think he would not? This isn't to say I disagree. I just defer it to both of you, your superior knowledge here. Why do you think he would not see China as a threat? Because it seems less militaristic than the Soviet Union, or
again, as I said, I can't be sure what he would think of China. I think that the part of what engaged him in the total combat against the Soviet Union was that it was very clear that the Soviet Union had recently, and in the lives of people like Chambers and Meyer, had been trying to mess domestically with the West by creating the internal debates that Buckley had to be part of himself. Now, people argue that China interferes in various ways through academic connections and so forth, but there is no comparison with what the Comintern was doing in the 1930s. And I think that side of it, and the fact that Buckley spent every day in the company of people who had been so much in the thick of that 1930s Comintern battle, shaped his life forever, shaped his view forever.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of his most wonderful writing in that kind of later period is about when he went to the opening of China with Nixon. He was one of the small group of journalists invited to go. He has an extraordinary, brilliant reportage on that.
Well,
that showed Buckley both the travelogue writer that Aaron mentioned and the Political Observer. Yeah.
Fascinating section in your book, because it really, to put it more bluntly, he was running interference for Nixon, and Nixon knew it. Nixon lined him up to try to get the conservatives to be at least half okay with the opening to China. And so it was an important role in American history that Buckley played, but it's not the one that you would have predicted from knowing his views on the Soviet Union.
Absolutely. In my view, I think it's quite unlikely. I mean, this gets back to his view of the Soviet Union. He viewed it, no doubt, as an existential threat. He would not view Venezuela, in my opinion, as an existential
Yeah,
threat.
that's a good point.
I believe he would not view Russia's incursion into Ukraine as an existential threat, though I believe he would be more concerned about that. So I think he might have taken China to be somewhat approaching an existential threat. But as Wally says, who knows? But I think he would be not in favor of these more limited engagements, particularly after seeing the effects of what seemed to be an unending war in Iraq. And I think he surely wanted to avoid that.
When I interviewed him near the end of his life, 2007, for a story I did on him that made its magazine story that made its way into the book, the much edited and rewritten. I asked him if the Iraq War could be the Republicans' Vietnam, because it was really Vietnam that destroyed the Democratic Party. He said, absolutely, it could be. Absolutely. He had witnessed enough history at that point. In a way, he became like those elders you guys, that Chambers and Burnham and Meyer and Kendall had been these great preceptors for him. And Buckley was one of the rare people, I think it was Kafka who said, men are either fathers or sons. Buckley actually was both. He was a rare one who was both. So when he was a son, I think you're both right. He absorbed all that anti-communism. And for those who want to get a sense of how wide his grasp was, I mentioned this in the book. There were a lot of people writing spy novels in the 70s and 80s when Buckley was writing bestsellers, CIA thrillers. Not many of them had mastered Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which Buckley read very closely, or had an annual lunch with Vladimir Nabokov in Montreux, Switzerland, to get the story of the Russian emigre, which actually worked into one of the novels. So that's Buckley's breadth. And also, so when the younger ones came along, that's when he became a kind of elder who less insistently. He's retired. He was semi-retired, and his health wasn't great. Was trying to sort of ease the movement away from some of those entanglements, and I think you're both right about that. And he also took a bit more bemused view. He didn't. He was as confused as all of us feel when we start to get older. Things that seem less clear to us.
Yeah. We've got another interesting question. It's not quite phrased as a two-parter, but I believe it to be. I was intrigued. This comes from Anonymous. I was intrigued whether you had any more to say about how he, Buckley, evaluated his achievements at the end of his life. Did he think NR was keeping his vision alive? Did he lament any particular ideological trends developing in the conservative movement? So as I said, I believe this to be a two-part question. One, how did he view the accession of John O'Sullivan immediately after his retirement? And then, let's say, how did he choose Rich Lowry after that? So that's the NR part. And then,
okay.
So let's get to the other perhaps broader question. How would he view particular ideological developments in the conservative/libertarian movement now?
Well, for some readers, I recommend a really excellent memoir our friend Rick Brookhiser wrote about his own time at National Review. I think it's called Right Time, Right Place. Yes. And he walks you through the steps. It's in part because he did that so well that I have less on it in my book. Just as Christopher Buckley writes so beautifully about Watergate, though I do have a fair amount more because it's just I uncovered new material. I think when he appointed John O'Sullivan, it's interesting. So that was in 1988, 1990, when Bill Buckley was stepping away. And Reagan's second term was finished. He'd kind of achieved what he wanted to. And the third term, in essence, seemed to be perpetuated by the election of Buckley's very good friend, Yale classmate, fellow Skull and Bonesman, fellow member of Bohemian Grove. Look, it's how these guys lived, We're seeing a different version of it in the Epstein diaries, whatever they're called, Epstein files. And he thought he could step away. And that's when he chose John O'Sullivan. Of course, it worked for Margaret Thatcher. And my understanding is that John was actually quite a skilled editor. He was not as efficient. Bill Buckley was extraordinarily disciplined and efficient in the way he went about his life from day to day. It helps to have two personal assistants, which he did. But nevertheless, if you walked into his study, you never saw such an unholy mess. But when it came to executing his obligations day to day, he was extraordinary. John O'Sullivan was a little slower. And so that bothered Bill a little bit. And this was a period, I should say, when I was getting to know Buckley, because I was writing the Chambers biography, so he would tell me what he thought. And he liked O'Sullivan. He didn't think he had quite the forcefulness of personality. But here's another thing. You guys will remember, I hope I'm not dating us too much, this was the period when there was a great vogue for bringing in British editors. Tina Brown came in and did Vanity Fair, Andrew Sullivan at the New Republic. And you might think Bill Buckley wasn't attuned to that, but only if you didn't know Bill Buckley, because he was very much aware of that. Remember, National Review was a New York magazine, at a time when the axis of power now ran through Washington, and maybe the University of Chicago. It was not New York so much anymore. Irving Kristol had moved his magazine, The Public Interest, to Washington. And then when the Weekly Standard started up, remember the Weekly Standard? That was the new threat. And some of the news, of course, I have in the book that some have reacted to is that when Bill Buckley was deciding who should replace John O'Sullivan, because he thought it was time for a new editor. So this was in the mid-90s. Then he was really looking at the Weekly Standard and its nucleus of stars and got permission from Bill Kristol, Irving's son, who was, of course, the founding editor of the Weekly Standard. And they're all part of the same family, same kind of emotional, ideological family. He got permission to talk to two of the young stars there, David Brooks and David Fromm. And I found an email. It's not in Buckley's own papers, by the way. It was in the papers of one of his good friends, Van Galbraith, who had been the ambassador to France under Reagan, one of Buckley's oldest friends going back to college, who was on the board of National Review, very successful investment banker. And Buckley had gone to Washington, interviewed some possible successors, and wrote a note to Van Galbraith to circulate among the board, saying he'd spoken with his other protege, George Will, and they agreed the next editor of National Review should be what Buckley called a believing Christian. And that eliminated both Fromm and Brooks. And in addition, he said he should be an American. He should be from America. Everybody knows Fromm is from Canada. People kind of forget that David Brooks was born in Canada. I don't think Bill Buckley saw David Brooks as a Canadian. Well, at the time, I will tell you here now for this intimate group we have, because it's not in the book, Buckley talked to me about those decisions at the time, because the Chambers book had just come out and he'd liked it very much and he'd been involved in it. And he said he didn't ask me, he would never think to ask me who should edit his magazine, and nor would I presume to suggest who it ought to be. But at one point I said, Brooks, who was then a star at the Weekly Standard and been at the Journal before, I said, this is a consequential journalist here and a really good columnist. And he said, well, are you saying Rich Lowry can't be that person? And I just didn't feel it was my place to respond to that. But it's interesting because younger people, younger journalists have really seized on that moment in the book. It comes so far near the end as being an important one. And so finally, I know Fromm fairly well. I know both those guys, Brooks and Fromm, and I know Rich a little bit. They're all excellent journalists, obviously. And so when I did David Fromm's podcast, I asked him about that because he'd been aware for years. I'd published this in one other place about what had happened with the editorship of National Review. And David told me, I don't think he's posted the podcast yet. He said, I knew I was being considered for that magazine to edit National Review. And I said, well, now you can answer the question. Would you have taken the job if it had been offered to you? And Fromm said, if I'd been offered that job, I would have said, no, the editor of National Review should be a believing Christian. He said it's no different from the editor of Commentary being Jewish. Now, it feels a little different to me, but still, I was quite struck by that.
But I should like to come to Buckley's defense here a bit. So you said before that the guiding light of Buckley's life was his Catholicism, which many people have stated. Now, should that have extended to his professional life? I express great reservation about that. However, he had many Jewish friends, personally, for sure. His famous salons attest to that. And as for David Brooks, I mean, Brooks Buckley delivered a lecture at UFC when University of Chicago when Brooks was an undergraduate, and he asked a very probing but um, very antagonistic question. And Buckley asked Brooks, "What is your name, young man?" And Brooks told him, he's like, "When you graduate, you will have a job at National Review."
Actually,
And
that's not what happened.
really,
Although you're absolutely right that he was extraordinarily generous to David Brooks. No, what happened, and Brooks admires him. No, what happened was Brooks wrote a humor column at the University of
that's
Chicago
right.
that a pub, yeah, and he wrote a parody of Buckley's
It was
most recent
Buckley's
book,
banner.
yeah,
Yes.
which was Overdrive. And David remembered that, and this has been kind of circulated generally, that Buckley then gave us a talk at the University of Chicago, said, "Where's David Brooks? I want to offer him a job." But I sent David the original column he wrote. And at the end of that column, he wrote, "I could use a job, Bill Buckley. How about it? Can you spare a dime?" So he'd actually been asking him for a job. And when I sent that to Brooks, I said, "Here's what you actually wrote." And Brooks said, "Wow, man, I was an even bigger suck up than I remembered." And look, he's a young guy, and Bill Buckley comes around. You want the job, but I want to ask something else to this too. He chose me. Like somebody, I gave a talk at a synagogue the other day, and somebody said, "What's a nice Jewish boy like you doing writing Bill Buckley's biography?" And I said, "Well, you have to ask Bill Buckley because he wanted me to do it." So the idea that Buckley was hostile to Jews is absurd. And the reason I mention that it's a little different from commentary is what David said to me, David Frum, was National Review is a Catholic magazine. Buckley never said that. He was very careful. It was not a magazine allied with Catholic theology. It was more like Commonweal. It was for the lay reader, but not specifically Catholic. But you're right, he did say it was a Christian magazine, and there's no reason it shouldn't be a Christian magazine.
And commentary was
I,
promoted by the American Jewish community.
That's
Great.
right.
Wally, I've interrupted you. I apologize.
yeah. Well,
No,
no.
no.
I'm getting signals from the Cato Tech team that we really do
Okay.
have to wrap
Right.
because they
We're out of here.
We've got one more question. I've really enjoyed this, but I do believe this is one that we will end with. Um, this fellow, first name Nick, uh, I came of age after Buckley's public life, but in watching old interviews and episodes of Firing Line, he appeared to be a happy warrior. Is this a fair characterization? If it is, does this happy warrior approach contribute to the fact that his opponents seem to like him even while disagreeing? This seems to be a nice way to sum up the discussion.
He absolutely was. He loved his life. He loved his friends. We mentioned his warmth. He one of the great things he brought to the movement, and Wally is right to be bringing us back to the earlier conservative movement, was he. Not to sound too much like some candidates in the last election, but he did bring a kind of joy to what he did, and enthusiasm and pleasure. He was quick to laugh, to make other people laugh. And these aspects of his are really, really important. You probably encountered those too, Wally. Just how much fun to be around he was.
Yeah, and his on-screen personality was not exactly the same as the off-screen, and yet you could tell it was the same person. He was very upbeat and cheerful either way, would to be in his company or to watch him, and that. And just to wrap up on this point, Buckley initially was making his name with the printed word, and then there's two things that, to me, make him a pivotal figure in the change in media. One is that for much of the country, he became better known for Firing Line than for all of the writing. And secondly, the anecdote that you tell, Sam, when he was running for mayor, the newspapers went on strike, and people had to get their New York news on TV. Suddenly Buckley's career took off because he was so entertaining on the screen in a way that no one else was. And so Buckley is the model of the personality that symbolizes the shift from print to non-print, if I can put it that grandly.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. He was a genius of media. He saw the connection. He saw how media was changing. and he got out in front. He was a pioneer. He was an extraordinary figure. Some people often say to me, and this is how I'll end, well, who's the next Buckley? Say, who's the next Buckley? There wasn't anybody like him before. So there's not going to be anybody like him since. There'll be other important and brilliant and fascinating people, but there won't be Bill Buckley.
Thank you, gentlemen. I believe this has been a very fascinating discussion, perhaps even better than I had expected. And one of the reasons that we did go over was that the discussion was so good. But moreover, I've been looking at the questions, and we anticipated many of the questions. So I apologize for not getting to some of them. However, I feel like we did address them. So thank you very much to the audience, and in particular, thank you to Wally and especially Sam. This is a monumental work, and it will last. It will last for. It will definitely stand the test of time.
Well, thank you both. It's really a pleasure.
And thank you both.
Okay. Thank you.